Je voulais remercier le directeur de l'école française d'Athènes, professeur Alexandre VROOM, et aussi les organisateurs de ce cycle céramique pour donner la possibilité de présenter une conférence ici et ce soir. Alors, c'est un grand honneur d'y être ici. Alors, malheureusement pour vous, je voulais continuer en anglais. Mais pas du tout pour une conférence, pour 1 heure. C'est trop pour moi. Alors, mais pour une introduction, ça va. Alors, maintenant, en anglais. Affichage. C'est en français. C'est ça, un peu difficile pour moi. Alors, oui, ok, merci beaucoup. Alors, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Of course, because I'm speaking here at the French school in Athens, which is, as I said before, a big honor for me, I start, of course, with a French title for my presentation today. In many ways, the journey of man, and I mean the stumbling forward we call civilization, is little more than a quest for things we lose on our way. The aim of this quest ranges from lost luggage to lost time, and from lost in the post to being lost for words. Perhaps the advantage of civilization is best summarized by the fact that in the last century we have progressed from à la recherche du temps perdu, so aptly translated in English as in search of lost time, to a hugely successful modern TV series on Netflix simply called Lost. The scholarly way of searching for things lost is archaeology. And the business of archaeology brings us, of course, automatically back to the French writer Marcel Proust, at least to his famous words, and I quote him here, "The voyage of discovery is not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes." End of the quote. And this is exactly what I would like to talk about this evening, because the lost faces I will be speaking about were not lost in a literal sense, so there was no real need to search for them. Quite the contrary, they were there to see for all archaeologists, but for many decades they were lost on purpose. They were discarded, moved aside, destroyed even. After all, one of the key methods of early Mediterranean archaeology was digging through the Byzantine, which means that all post-classical layers and all post-classical ceramics were to be removed out of sight as quickly as possible. Together with these layers, all archaeological information on the history of habitation since antiquity was also removed and, more often than not, lost forever. During the last decades, this has changed, luckily enough, and the interest in these post-classical remains, artifacts, and societies has increased dramatically. And to use the words of Proust, Mediterranean archaeology has not discovered new landscapes, but has acquired new eyes. The quite revolutionary rise of post-classical archaeology has not only changed the way excavations are conducted in the Mediterranean, but it has contributed greatly to the way we can now understand the Byzantine, the Frankish, Ottoman, and early modern history and societies in this area. It is for all these reasons that I have chosen the title À la recherche du vase perdu as a working title for my lecture, within with an archaeological emphasis of this Kyklos Keramikis here at the French School at Athens. I've added the subtitle, An Overview of Greek Pottery from Medieval to Modern Times, to give you more of a clue what I'm actually going to present here. As most of you may have already understood by now, I do something with pottery. And I work for various international archaeological projects in the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. In fact, I've been involved as a pottery specialist with these archaeological projects, excavations, as well as surveys in the Eastern Mediterranean. And until now, I have worked in countries such as Greece, Turkey, Albania, Cyprus, and the South Ukraine, Jordan, and in the last 2 years also in Oman on the Persian Gulf. And during the summer, I often travel from one project to another, and I'm therefore known among some of my colleagues as the Flying Dutch Woman. So this evening, I would like to give you a short overview of some of the research subjects I've worked on, and I'm still working on, and I would like to show you in more detail some material from 2 projects as a case study today. As such, I will touch upon some wider themes in medieval and post-medieval archaeology in the Eastern Mediterranean, such as chronology, trade, the quantity and variety of material culture on sites, as well as the archaeology of consumption and after consumption. So, the first part of my lecture today will be about my research project at Leiden University, which I will show in particular its research methodology and its key research topics. And then the second part of my lecture I will present 2 case studies of vertical and horizontal stratigraphy in Greece, as it concerns medieval pottery finds from an excavation in Athens and post-medieval pottery finds from a survey on the island of Kythera. By the way, I'm not only covering a large geographical area, but also a long chronological period. So as you can see here on this slide, for instance, a chronological division of medieval and post-medieval ceramics in the Eastern Mediterranean is presented here, and which I have used for my research for several archaeological projects in Greece. And this division is based in the first place on the stylistic and technological changes of pottery and not on historical or political events, although the period labels do have obvious historical connotations. We should be aware that pottery in certain regions has its own rhythm of change and does not necessarily obey the chronological schemes and schedules of historians. As you may have seen here on this slide, the term early Byzantine refers here to pottery produced and used in the period between approximately the 7th and 9th centuries. Middle Byzantine refers to pottery produced and used between circa the 10th and the 12th centuries, when major changes in pottery production occurred in the Aegean, creating pottery types with distinctively different characteristics. I use the term late Byzantine Frankish for new pottery types produced and used from the 13th century to the mid-15th century, which is the period that the Crusaders, the so-called Franks, came to Greek lands, and the term Turkish Phoenician period is used as heading for all pottery which dates from approximately the late 15th to the 18th century, the period of control in the Aegean by the Ottoman Empire and the Phoenician Republic. Then the designation early modern refers to traditional pottery made by local potters in the Aegean, as well as to the first appearance of industrialized wares from the West, which can be roughly dated from the 19th to the mid-20th centuries. And then finally, modern starts for me in the 1950s with the mass production and the mass distribution of industrialized wares, and most of the times from the West, and also with the first appearance of plastic vessels in the Aegean. And I just quickly want to show you the pottery that we will be seeing today will be in the range of Middle Byzantine to modern period, so that you know which centuries I will be talking about. However, archaeology would be rather one-dimensional if it would only consider pottery finds as a tool for quantification and dating. And all too often we tend to forget in our search for archaeological explanations that the main function of pottery has always been that of a common everyday utensil in the kitchen, on the table, in the cupboard, and in transport. And these functions reveal themselves in fabrics, surface treatments, and shapes. And one of the questions to be answered is whether technological and functional varieties in pottery production from Byzantine times onwards in the Aegean were only the result of technical innovations in the potter's craft and of social economic factors such as an increased demand for imports, or also of actual changes in the consumption of food and or by changes in dining habits of the local population. And if so, the problem is to how get an accurate picture of these changing socio-economic circumstances and dining habits. So, in short, one should think of the person behind the broken pieces of pottery. Now, evidence for my paper is taken from published and unpublished material from various archaeological excavations and surveys in the Mediterranean, which were studied on behalf of my Fede research project with the title Material Culture, Consumption and Social Change, New Approaches to Understanding the Eastern Mediterranean During Byzantine and Ottoman Times at Leiden University. And for this project, I studied with a small research team, among which some are also here in the audience. I would like to mention my postdoctoral researcher, Ellie Zavella, who's also here, who has worked with me in particular on long-term patterns in production, distribution, consumption, and social changes of 4 coastal urban centers in the Eastern Mediterranean. And they are shown here from west to east, so we talk about Butrint, Athens, Ephesus, and Tarsus. And these sites were chosen due to their long history of habitation and to their geographical situation. 2 of them are in fact situated in the core area of the Byzantine to Ottoman empires, one, such as Athens, on the western coast, and the other, Ephesus, on the eastern coast of the Aegean. And the other 2 sites are located in the peripheries of both empires. So Butrint in the Western Balkans is affected by its proximity to medieval Italy, while it also participates in the economic and political networks that interconnect the Western Balkans. And Tarsus, on the other hand, becomes a crossroad of Byzantine, Arab, and Crusader cultures. And the material coming from the excavations there highlights the cross-cultural interaction between the Christian and the Islamic world. And here I'd like to show you also quickly the 5 key issues of our Fede research project and our methodology. So first of all, it concerns a different approach of the material culture of the Byzantine and Ottoman empires. And these empires succeeded each other, were closely interwoven, and played through the centuries an important role as the East in relation to Western Europe. Secondly, new in our research is that we study the material culture of these 2 empires in a real long-term perspective in order to get more knowledge on historical developments, on social changes, as well on cultural continuity and discontinuity in the period between the 7th and the 20th centuries. And thirdly, we would like to understand the changing shapes of objects in relation to socio-economic developments. In short, the research is not only concentrated on the diagnosis and dating of material, especially ceramics, how interesting this also can be, but also on the understanding of material culture in broader contexts, such as changing distribution systems, changing cooking and dining manners, and changing social identities. Fourthly, we will use a comparing perspective of 4 important urban centers and their hinterland. And these include, as I said before, Butrint, Albania, Athens in Greece, Ephesus in western Turkey, and Tarsus in eastern Turkey, which we will compare with rural sites found during various archaeological surveys in the countryside. And then finally, we will use a multidisciplinary approach combining archaeological artifacts, written sources, and pictorial evidence as sources of information. And I will explain more about this approach in a while during my lecture. But let's now go back to the hard reality and the alien galaxy of broken pots as we find them in archaeological projects. This is how we find those pots in excavations, as on the left image, and in an intensive surface survey, as on the right image. And this is the soil archive that we need to read and analyze. And this then, on the next slide, is the result after cleaning, counting, reconstruction, etc. of the pots. So the best part of any research is to have a wonderful data set at one's disposal, which offers many possibilities for the study of changing production and distribution systems, of changing cooking and eating habits, and of changing social identities. And in order to make sense out of thousands and thousands of shirts of different fabric, shape, decoration, function, and provenance that come from 4 different sites and span over 13 centuries of use, we record everything systematically in our database that has been designed specifically for the needs of this project. The database is also connected to our ArcGIS software that allows us to create distribution maps of ceramics and study the location of pottery in relation to the location of other artifacts. And the combination of spatial distribution maps, photographs, and 3D models, as shown here in the case of the so-called Triconch Palace in Butrint during the so-called early Phoenician, or rather Renaissance period, can only be useful for displaying the location of artifacts, but can also highlight where pottery was found with different characteristics in terms of shape, chronology, function, and provenance. And this type of analysis helps us understand changes in the types and location of activities and periods of use for the various areas within a site. It also allows us to follow processes of space organization, site development in relation to food waste, eating practices, and dining manners during the medieval and post-medieval periods. What I'm quickly going to show you here today are some key research topics of our study on ceramic finds in the Eastern Mediterranean, showing not only the process of dating pottery fragments, but rather the use of models to understand long-term developments in the medieval and post-medieval ceramic production, habitation, distribution, and consumption. Now let us first turn to the production of pottery. It is good to know that all 4 urban centers within my Fede project at Leiden are production sites. So we have evidence for this from excavated kilns, from drawings of kilns in excavation diaries, as well as from excavated potter's tools such as tripod stills. And these last ones were used, of course, for separating glazed wares during the firing process in a kiln. Now, sometimes these tripod stills were found in combination with wasters and unfinished products, and as such, they show production zones of industrial activity within a certain site, as is in the case here in Ephesus, where we have an industrial area for pottery production southwest of the Suluk Hill, as you can see on the image on the right. In order to get a better understanding of the local wares from the 4 urban centers, we study the fabrics carefully, either with a digital microscope in the field or with petrographical analysis in the lab or through an ethnographical approach. And I have to say that I work with a professional potter in our ceramic lab in Leiden, who is trained to do this kind of research and is also trained to remake some of the excavated pots through experimental archaeology. Furthermore, a heavy mineral analysis and chemical analysis have been carried out on samples taken from pottery collections from some of the 4 sites until now. And I would like to mention here some of the international labs here in Athens, the Demokritos lab, the Fitch lab, the Lyon the labs in Vienna and Sheffield, and some of my international collaborators. And I would like to mention here Joanita VROOM, who you will also see on this slide, Vangilio Kyriatsi, Vasilis Kilikoulou, Anno Hein, and Adamantia Panayopoulou. So from production, I would also now turn to habitation. And I would like to show you here in the case of Athens that we are sometimes dealing with a complex type of urban archaeology with complicated excavation layers, showing continuous habitation intermingled with discontinuity. And we study the excavated finds from, for instance, Athens and the Agora in combination with architectural remains in order to reconstruct periods of use and the function of buildings, as we also have done here with a late Roman and early Byzantine complex in Athens from an old excavation that was carried out in the 1930s. It is also perhaps good to inform you that this previous 3D construction of the building was made in cooperation with Ellie Tzavella and her brother Yanis Tsavelli. And we also tried to reconstruct here the interior of one of the rooms in this complex with the exact copies of the actual excavated artifacts on the table. And from this recent excavation of a tower in Butrint, we used the finds not only for dating the chronology, but also for the reconstruction of the building, as well as for the location and the use of the finds within the building. So because of this work, we were able to get a better grip of the period, which is also known as the Dark Ages in Byzantine times. Now we see also here the so-called Triconch Palace in Butrint again, as we have seen before, but this time with medieval structures on top of the late Roman structures, and as such urban continuity through the reuse of buildings. And furthermore, on the images below, we see the spatial distribution of the excavated pottery finds within this complex according to period, function, wear, etc. Now, if we zoom further out in Butrint, we see here an overall map of Butrint showing the spatial distribution of the later pottery finds all over the site. In order to understand different periods of use for the various excavated areas on the peninsula and also on the other side of the channel. From here, we can move to a distribution map with long-distance imports to one site in the Eastern Mediterranean, as I have shown here in the case of Ephesus, which shows imports to this site in the Western Turkey in a certain period of time. So here you see imports from the, especially the 14th and 15th centuries. Or we can move to a distribution map of interregional long-distance contexts. So in this case, the distribution of one ware, in this case, so-called Succipus ware of the 13th and early 14th centuries in the Eastern Mediterranean, showing the intra-regional context. Or we can even go further by showing a distribution map of interregional long-distance context through the Silk Road and the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, the rest of Europe, Africa, and Asia. So we are dealing here with a kind of globalization in this time of the period, and in this time of the trade in luxury ceramics. So as you can see from detail, we can go further and further into larger distribution maps. Another aim of the research project is to combine archaeological artifacts, written documents, and pictorial evidence as sources of information in the period of study from Byzantine to Ottoman times. As a matter of course, the material culture is the focus point of our research. We see here, for instance, in the center 2 dishes, one Byzantine dish on the top and an Ottoman one on down, as we find them often in excavations. In addition, written sources such as cookery books, medical manuals, inventory lists, and hagiographic texts, as well as contemporary dining scenes and art, can play an important role in understanding the long-term changes and function of these dishes. As such, we would like to build a web of arguments to answer questions about Byzantine and Ottoman material culture, and I've shown in my earlier publications that this is a fruitful approach. And I have to admit, of course, that many of these written sources have already been collected by Phaidon Koukoulas in his 5th volume on Byzantine life and civilization, which was published before by the French school, of course, in 1952. In fact, the existence of certain patterns of dining or eating habits during these periods seem to be supported by the archaeological evidence, as is shown in this fresco from circa 1200 in Karanlik, Kilise, from Göreme in Turkey, in combination with contemporary excavated objects from Corinth, Serbia, and Chersonesos in the Crimea, offering as such new insights in the use and social context of dining habits in Middle Byzantine society. In my book After Antiquity, published in 2003, and for those of you who are interested, I put the book also here on the table so you can have a look at it after the discussion. Anyway, in this book I've discussed in more detail the differences in table manners from late antiquity to late Ottoman times, from circa mid-7th to the late 19th century, utilizing a range of methods. And one of these was the measurement of rim and base diameter of tablewares from various periods in order to explore the use of open vessels in relation to consumption patterns in the Aegean. And this idea was further expanded by analyzing 12 excavated contexts of different periods in the Eastern Mediterranean in order to calculate the changes in height and volume of open vessels in the Byzantine tableware repertoire. And as you can see here on this slide, the height of these vessels increases through the centuries, while the volume decreases enormously. And this trend can even be more distinguished when one studies the vessels depicted in the iconography of the period. Another perspective was thus to look at long-term changes in eating habits and dining manners in combination with corresponding table settings between different periods in order to distinguish patterns of communal dining versus individual dining, as is shown here with one example of the Middle Byzantine period. For the Ottoman and modern times, the representations which can be studied consist of Ottoman book miniatures, oil paintings of Western painters, woodcuts, and illustrations in travelers' accounts depicting dining scenes and the consumption of food in the Aegean during Ottoman and Phoenician times. However, it is not always an easy task to compare the humble pottery fragment on the surface with a document in the archives. And of course, I'm aware of the fact that I'm dealing here with a complex mix of different sources of evidence which should be treated with an understanding of their limitations. Still, I believe that the combination of information obtained by a typochronological and functional approach of the ceramics, by scrutinizing the literary sources and by looking with a critical eye at the long-term socio-historical representation of medieval and post-medieval table utensils, including pottery, may prove to be a fruitful way to come to relevant conjectures about the past. In addition, I also like to show you that 3D scanning and 3D printing also has much potential for the reconstruction of the use of medieval decorated tableware, as was demonstrated in the exhibition Sgraffito in 3D, in which I was involved. For this exposition, which took place in 2008 in the Museum Boijmans van Beuningen in Rotterdam, 22 Sgraffito dishes of the museum's collection were scanned with the CT scanner in a local medical center, after which 7 were copied through the process of 3D scanning and 3D printing. And you see indeed on the left image how the pots were going through the CT scanner in the hospital in 2008. So visitors in the exhibition could touch, pick up and manipulate the 3D printed replicas in the museum, as seen on the right. Furthermore, augmented reality installations offered visitors tactile interaction and direct visual access to background knowledge of the pots exhibited safely behind glass. Now, apart from 3D scanning of complete glazed vessels, as shown here, also 3D scanning of broken pottery fragments can help us with the reconstruction of pottery. Such 3D visualizations clearly improve the conclusions drawn from archaeological data and enhance the presentation of artifacts in exhibitions and in online websites. And I would like to draw your attention to the following website of the exhibition Sgraffito in 3D that you still can find online, and where you also will see how the pots were printed or scanned in 3D, and you can use the scans. And secondly, there's also a very nice film on the website that you can see how we use these new techniques for this exhibition. And it's maybe also interesting to know that after the discussion, I can also show you the 3D scan of this fragment here on the screen, if people are interested. And furthermore, it's maybe interesting to know that in 2 years' time, I've been invited to organize an exhibition in Istanbul at the RCIC Center of Koç University to give an exhibition on a new perspective on Ottoman archaeology in Turkey with the use of 3D technology. And we will also be using material from excavations like in Ephesus, but also from surveys like this fragment, which comes from a survey around Sardis, east of Izmir. Okay, so apart from all this, food also needs to be cooked, of course. And so beside to the study of glazed and decorated tablewares, it has also always been my intention to study in great detail the various cooking techniques through fabric compositions and use marks on excavated pots in combination with pictorial evidence. And I show you here a case study with regard to changing pottery shapes and related cooking techniques as demonstrated by brittleware cooking jars from southeastern Turkey. And these cooking pots show slight shape changes from Roman to late antique Umayyad times, and then suddenly a major alteration in the early Abbasid period, in the early Islamic period. So in order to explain these shape changes, other sources on diet, such as archaeozoological research, so the study on animal bones, and written documents were explored in order to understand these changes in shape and cooking techniques. Another key aspect in this research was indeed to look at patterns in diet. So what were people consuming in the past? And this was, for instance, done by looking for more information in cookery books through counting the main ingredients in late antique Islamic and medieval recipes. And in addition, these data on the most used ingredients from different documents can be compared between various periods and between various regions in the Mediterranean and the Eastern Mediterranean. However, looking at written texts, art and monuments only, it is hard to get an idea about everyday activities of an average person in Byzantium or in the Ottoman Empire. And this is where archaeology, and especially household archaeology, can play an important role by analyzing multiple lines of evidence in order to get a better understanding of the Byzantine and Ottoman past. In fact, household archaeology tries to incorporate many types of evidence, and combining different levels of data can lead to a much richer understanding of the Byzantine past. Now, some of the written sources, including religious texts, inform us about aspects of daily life. For instance, what people were eating and which foods were forbidden to eat in certain periods because of fasting rules. Pictorial evidence of meals survive in manuscripts, but also in mosaics and frescoes. And some of these show us scenes of everyday life, informing us about the type of foods people ate, what pottery and furniture they used, but also about customs with respect to wining and dining. Artifacts assemblages are groups of different artifacts found in association with one another, that is to say, in the same context. And all these artifacts put together can help us in many ways, for example, to reconstruct past activities and as dating evidence. Excavated remains or architecture of houses enable us to reconstruct how Byzantines existed in their daily lives. And the archaeological finds provide information about various activities in different parts of the house. Parts of fruits, vegetables, and animal bones or shells from botanical and faunal assemblages are also preserved in the archaeological record, showing us what Byzantines were eating. Seeds and pits, so macro remains, can be found in chest pits. Pollen and phytoliths, like micro remains, can be analyzed to tell us about the plants used or consumed at a location. With respect to microarchaeological techniques, such as biomolecular or biochemical components of organic materials associated with human activity, can survive in a wide variety of locations and deposits at archaeological sites and also on objects. And these residues and traces, often not visible with the naked eye, can be studied using chemical and microscopic analysis. And finally, what we eat and drink leaves traces in our bones and teeth in the form of stable isotopes. And human bones and teeth recovered from archaeological sites can be analyzed isotopically for information regarding diet and migration. But how are we able to do this kind of household archaeology in Byzantine cities? Now, today, I would like to explore some of these lines of evidence with a few examples of pottery finds from old excavations in the Athenian Agora and from a more recent survey on the island of Kythera. And let us start with Athens first. When we zoom in the city, and in particular in the Byzantine city, we may notice that the excavated area of the Athenian Agora is actually situated as a suburb west of the Byzantine fortification wall. And we are currently studying Byzantine to Ottoman material from excavations in the Athenian Agora run by the American School of Classical Studies from the 1930s onward, with special attention to the later post-Roman ceramics. And I would therefore like to thank Professor James Wright, the director of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, and also Professor John Camp, director of the Athenian Agora excavations of the American School, as well as his team in the Agora, for allowing us and helping us to cooperate in studying and publishing the later material from the excavations in the ancient Agora of Athens. Now, on the left drawing, we see, of course, and we can distinguish a plan of the Athenian Agora. And we see a picture how the Agra looked like at the moment that the Americans started with the excavations in the 1930s. And on the right image, we see the current situation with the reconstructed Stoa of Attalus, where now all the pottery from the excavations are based and stored. Now, in some previous summers, I focused with my team on the study of the material which was dated in the 7th to 9th centuries in the Agra, which is called the Dark Age period or the early Byzantine period, a period which is not very well understood and which is actually very understudied in Athens and other parts of Greece. And although our work is still in an initial stage, we can already see evidence for different types of activities, including habitation, industry, and public spaces outside the late Roman wall, in contrary to prior beliefs. And we are also discovering great differences in the type and intensity of occupation in different sections of the Agra per period. Now, in the Agra, of course, we further study also any changes in shapes and sizes of tablewares through various periods. So in this case, you see tablewares from the early Byzantine to the Middle Byzantine period and eventually to the Middle Byzantine, Late Byzantine period, as you can see on this slide, in order to distinguish long-term changes in eating habits and dining manners. And this assemblage on this slide presents a late medieval tableware setting of the late 13th to 15th centuries with vessels for dining, drinking, serving food and pouring liquids, which were found in an agora well. And noteworthy are 3 imported vessels. The one on the right is actually a small bowl of a so-called rouletteware from the Veneto region in Italy. The dish on the left is a Spanish lusterware from Valencia, while the one on the center is a base fragment of archaic maiolica from Italy, painted with a heraldic device, a coat of arms on the inside. And they are all 3 of a small size, which could fit only 1 portion of food, and they were probably rather used for personal than for communal use. Various changes in table manners took in fact place in the Eastern Mediterranean in this period of time, as can be noticed in the 14th and 15th century painted dining scenes from late Byzantine art. We may conclude that the pictorial evidence in combination with the actual artifacts from the Agra show a first start of more elaborate or small group dining in a Western style in Athens from late Byzantine, late medieval times onwards. And this transition took place at a different pace in different parts of the Mediterranean, but it must have definitely reached Athens by the 14th and 15th centuries. Now, apart from tablewares, dining habits, and table settings, we have, of course, also been documenting Byzantine utilitarian vessels, such as these cooking pots and jars within the Agra repertoire, in order to study these cooking utensils in combination with petrographical research on their fabrics and with, hopefully, future organic residue analysis on their contents. And the presence of ovens, wells, or pitoi, so large storage jars, may indicate the function space as a kitchen or as a storage room in the Agra. The area below many excavated houses in the Athenian Agra, as shown here as section MM, had large storage containers of various sizes, which were most of the time stuck into the ground. And in order to visualize this, I've made with a research master student from Leiden University, and his name is Yannick Boswinkel, we've made a 2D map of 3 house structures in a complex in section MM, showing several interesting characteristics. A number of installations can now be identified in multiple phases of the complex, which included pitoi, basins, chest pits, wells, and funerary structures. As you can see on this map, most pitoi are concentrated on the eastern side of the complex, and especially in 2 rooms in the northwest part of this eastern structure. A 3D reconstruction adds to the visualization of the 3 structures. When looking at the 3D model, it is immediately clear that the wells, shown here in pink, lie a lot lower than the other structures. And similarly, the pitoi of the final phase, shown here in red, lie a lot higher than those of the pre- and post-fire periods, showing the long period of use or even of reuse of these pitoi. And the pitoi can be subdivided in 2 types. They are either built in tiles and fieldstones with hard lime mortar or as a large ceramic vessel. And there are 17 masonry-built pitoi, so 63% of the total in these structures, and 10 ceramic pitoi in the complex. Both types are found throughout the 3 buildings and all identified faces, and both types have a carefully built rim and are made non-porous, suggesting that they could have been used to store liquids such as olive oil, wine or vinegar, and solid foods like grain, fruit, vegetable and legume. They were all buried in the ground with only the upper opening left outside. And this provided not only an ideal dry, cool environment and a constant temperature for storage, but also protected their contents from harmful external effects such as rodents, mice or bugs. The only distinction that can be made between the 2 types is in quantity and in size. The built stone pitoi have on average a 54% larger diameter and are 36% higher. And it is conceivable that it was easier to create larger pitoi with stone masonry than it was to create large ceramic ones. Many pitoi in the agora are equal to or even taller than human height. Their bottoms were made flat to enable them to stand easily and to stabilize their weight. The vessels were covered either with a lid made of wood or of earthenware or with a square stone slab. And chemical analysis carried out in Pergamon in the Byzantine period show on the interior distillate pine or cypress resin in order to seal these containers and as a preservative in wine storage. From the data set onwards and set up for the 3 structures in section MM, the pottery finds can be dated in the early, middle and late Byzantine periods. And the focus of the research was to see if there were any trends and observable differences between assemblages of the 3 houses during the 3 periods. The pottery was subsequently divided by function, including amphorae, courseware, heavy utility, and other, and tableware, of course. So, and for other, we used oil lamps and candlesticks in this category. So looking at this graph, it is clear that the earliest period has more courseware, whereas towards the later period, so the Middle Byzantine and even more in the late Byzantine period, we may notice more quantities of tableware. In order to appoint finds to inside the 3 houses, 5 locations were created: west, middle and east, and 2 squares outside the structures, middle west and east middle. And in the Middle Byzantine and late Byzantine periods, the amount of ceramics in the middle house is much lower. So we find tablewares in the eastern and western house, but the middle house is almost devoid of tablewares. Furthermore, if we look at the east, middle and middle west areas in between the houses, we notice that they follow the general trends of the 3 houses. So in the Middle Byzantine and late Byzantine periods, only tableware is found in these areas and no other types of pottery. While in the earlier periods, these 2 areas were more or less a reflection of the assemblages in the houses. However, we should also be aware of the missing materials in the studied assemblages. We just do not know the precise importance of ceramics within a normal Byzantine household. And we may assume that vessels made of cheaper materials, such as wood and leather, almost certainly occupied a position at least as important as that of pottery. And where metal vessels were largely confined to aristocratic and upper clerical households, in humbler kitchens, food could be prepared, cooked, and served in vessels made from wood, basketry, leather, or stone. Now, let's now turn to my second case study for today, which is situated on the island of Kythera in Greece. It concerns here a survey project of UCL London and the British School in Athens, and I would like to thank Professor Cyprian Broadbank, currently now at University of Cambridge, and Dr. Vangelio Kyriazzi of the Fitch Lab at the British School in Athens for studying the later finds from their survey. It is a good example of horizontal stratigraphy, where the pottery finds were sampled on the surface over a wide area, and the survey area has been concentrated on the central eastern region of Kythera. Within the survey area, circa 15% of the island was intensively surveyed, and tracked walking was designed to sample the survey area in regular 1 kilometer wide north-south transects. And as you can see here on this slide, the transect sample is shown in yellow outline, and the shaded light parts are the parts in the landscape which were inaccessible. Despite the sometimes difficult survey circumstances, as you can see on the upper image on the left, circa 200 sites were found in the landscape. With the help of distribution maps, such as this one made by GIS of pottery finds from the 19th and 20th centuries in the survey area, I'm trying to explore the possibilities and potential of shirt density figures, and especially the quantity of survey shirts as an important source of information. On this map, we can see especially the quantity of the largest amounts of material in quantity, and the squares actually show side material and the dots off-side material, constituting thus a huge proportion of all the shirts brought in from tracked walking, and this being a combined result of a high density in the landscape and the superior standard of preservation of the pottery finds. Apart from studying local products from Kythera, I'm also looking at the distribution and use of imported products on the island, such as this transfer printed plate of the 19th century from Staffordshire, England, with its well-known willow pattern. Additional sources of information which can help with my research of the material culture on the island during medieval and post-medieval times include textual sources such as Phoenician and Ottoman text registers, standing architecture such as houses and churches, as well as oral and ethnographic information. And we had until recently, and we still have, contact with a local potter's family on the island who was very much involved and still is in making pots on the island for generations. Now here we see a distribution map of imported wares of the 19th century and early 20th century from the east and from the west, and surprisingly there are really not many differences in the distribution and use of these wares on the island. As I had expected another pattern with more Western wares, I have to admit. It is with the introduction of industrial manufactured wares in the 19th century, which were cheaper and mass-produced in the West, that consumption patterns in Greece began to change. The introduction of these industrial manufactured wares were accompanied by socio-economic changes, for example, by an increase in consumer purchasing power and by new distribution methods such as steamships, as well as, of course, changes in cooking techniques and dining habits. there are nowadays, and these changes are nowadays reflected in the large quantities of recent ceramics, mainly of the 19th and early 20th centuries, that archaeological survey teams discover on the surface in Kythera. However, despite the Western predominance of imported wares in this period, it is remarkable to see so much pottery finds from the East as well. And when Greece became a modern state in the 19th century, this might have encouraged the import and the use of these Eastern wares from the Aegean. On the next slide, we may notice the distribution of early modern pitoy fragments from Koroni on Kythera. And Koroni, of course, as many of you know, is situated on the southwestern Peloponnese and is famous for the production of these wares, which were related to olive oil production and its distribution. Anyway, we may notice on this distribution map the difference between coast versus inland situation, and we can see a concentration of pitoy finds from Koroni in, for instance, this region, which is also known, and it's especially here, and this region is also known as the Livadi region. Now, if we look and if we like to consider relation between archaeology and text, it is interesting to look at this Phoenician document of 1760 AD, and this source mentions the amount of olive trees and recipienti da olio, or olive oil jars, showing most olive cultivation and the use of olive oil jars in the Livadi region. As so many pitos fragments from Koroni were found inland in that same part of the island, it seems obvious to relate these jars to this olive oil production and use. And furthermore, olive trees are often not found on the coasts of Greek islands because of the strong winds, which are bad for growing this kind of trees. In this way, the archaeological artifacts can confirm or complement the information provided in written sources, which in the case of Kythera are often biased by a Phoenician perspective, or give only partial information since they were produced by and for the elite and have therefore little to say about the activities of the rest of the population on the island. Another example of the archaeology of consumption on Kythera is from the vicinity of Evlomenos, identified by earlier travelers as one of the island's principal ports or harbors after antiquity. We can see here images and distribution maps of pottery finds around the fort of Evlomenos, which was built by the Phoenicians in the 16th century. The pottery finds can tell us when Evlomenos began to operate as a port, when it became more important, what range of pottery arrived in terms of its pan-Mediterranean origins, and also the function of the pots involved, such as storage jars, cooking pots, pitoy, or eating and serving ware. And we can see, for instance, on these maps, the distribution of small open vessels, here called sope, and these are bowls and dishes for on the table, versus the distribution of cooking pots. This slide involves the archaeology of marginality, or the question of the dating of and activities that took place at the countless small rural structures that appeared in the landscape of Kythera during the past few centuries and prior to the present abandonment of farming on the island. The textual and ethnographic records suggest a complex range of possibilities, such as occasional use, seasonal residence or pioneer settlement, and the pottery finds from such sites can play a part in choosing between those options. For instance, we can distinguish many jacons, and jacons are actually jugs, in fields around the village of Mitata. And this is not only related to the use of water from jugs for drinking during the work on the fields, but also to bind wheat shuffles on the field. Interesting is also to see the disposal of pottery and other rubbish in the immediate surroundings around the village of Mitata on the island. In fact, the discard pattern of communities in the 19th and 20th centuries is another subject which I hope to explore more in the near future. The idea that rubbish or garbage is a useful source of cultural information about the past is hardly novel. And as you can see here, the intentional breaking of pots is not only a Greek phenomenon, but also happened in medieval Britain. In the end, the sites of many archaeological digs or excavations are rubbish heaps under another name, and the pottery fragments and flint scraps that we look at in museums are really just very old garbage. The idea that rubbish or garbage is a useful source of information is also shown here. So over time, ancient cities rose high above the surrounding plains on massive mounds called tels or huyuks, which contained the ascending remains of centuries, even millennia, of prior occupation. And here we can see, for instance, a cutaway view of one section of ancient Troy, which reveals how the city managed, literally, to surmount its garbage problems through the periods. And the other reconstruction below Troy is a reconstruction by William Grimes of a rescue and research excavation at Gutter Lane, Cheapside, in the city of London, showing again Roman deposits, medieval pits, and later features. So rubbish has always been a big problem in cities, from prehistory until the present day. And for example, on the picture above, we can distinguish a modern landfill on Staten Island in New York City compared to the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan in Mexico below. The Pyramid of the Sun is roughly 800 feet to a side, and the landfill grid as a whole represents an area roughly 3 miles by 4 miles and reaches a height of 505 feet above sea level. In that way, the Staten Island landfill is 25 times the size of the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt, 40 times the size of the Temple of the Sun at Teotihuacan in Mexico, and its volume is approaching the Great Wall of China. So, in the end, there's more waste than meets the eye. In short, dumping on the surface has always been the method of garbage disposal favored every time and everywhere, especially within cities and also on the rural side. Nevertheless, in an effort to improve living conditions within cities during medieval times, rules were promulgated and places for the storage of rubbish were created. Initially, rubbish was thrown in pits, but during the 14th and 15th centuries, chest pits were increasingly installed behind or under medieval houses, and their construction varied according to the nature of the ground and town planning. In northwestern Europe, there is a long tradition in the excavation of rubbish and chest pits, and human waste has always attracted quite some interest from archaeologists. On the next slide, you can see 2 examples of rubbish pits and chest pits from the Mediterranean, from Durrës in Albania and from Thebes in central Greece. It is perhaps interesting to know that in both places, these jug-like vessels, which are also called ibrik in Turkish and also in modern Greek, were often found in the Ottoman layers of the pits in these 2 cities. It concerns here mostly unglazed jugs with a spout for serving and pouring liquids or for some sort of function connected to sanitary use such as hand washing or anything alike. Finally, I would like to suggest in a more general sense that in an archaeological perspective there's indeed a future for rubbish of the past. On the left image, you can distinguish a modern dump of post-party garbage in a Greek mountain village after a panegyri. And on the right, the modern dating tool for future archaeologists. That is to say, a pull tab typology of aluminium cans in the late 20th century. And this pull tab typology shows an astonishingly wide stylistic variation, even in such a relatively standardized item of everyday life. And this proves, again, I think, that throughout human history, even party and every party results in an after party for archaeologists. So, in the end, to conclude with my last slide, we made the circle round, starting with the quest for things we lose on our way to the archaeology of modern rubbish. In order to digest all this information, I would like to finish my lecture now after showing you my looking glass of different methods and the start of new ideas for studying ceramics in the medieval and post-medieval Mediterranean. In case you are interested to read and hear more about all this, I would like to suggest to look at the first two websites references with more information and with further publications that are showing on this slide. And also I would like to show the third reference, which includes, by the way, an online exhibition with the title The Archaeology of a Byzantine City that I have made with some of my research master students at Leiden University, and which includes some of the research topics mentioned today. So, rest me only to say that we can now move to the discussion, and I would like to thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
We thank you very much for your very interesting paper and conference about archaeology of the past, archaeology of the present, and archaeology of the future, with the last aperçu. I'm sure we will have some questions about the material you showed. So, is there any question in English, in French, or in Greek? We can. Yorgos?
I was being patient to ask second or third. Joanita, this was a very stimulating presentation, and I think I'm expressing the entirety of the people in this room. And let me just remind our kind audience that the reason we wanted, the three organizers, we wanted you to start this series of lectures, was twofold. One, we wanted to inject some science in an area that has been judging the ceramics only on grounds of aesthetics or some folklore information. And two, because we wanted to inject the desire for research among many people, some of them archaeologists, some of them researchers of more modern periods. And we thought that a methodological tool as yours, which is multifaceted and multifunctional and multi-sourced, would really give a lot of food for thought. So I savored every moment of your presentation, although I have huge disagreements with some of the. I'm joking. I would like to point out one major thing, and I'm thinking loud. I have spent many years in visiting and photographing old houses, especially derelict ones, mainly on the islands of the Aegean, but elsewhere in Greece as well. And I have an instinctive theory of what happens when a house gets deserted. And unless there is a forced movement of its inhabitants, in which case all of your methodology finds me completely in accordance, in agreement, unless it is a forced departure of its inhabitants, the way that these houses get deserted is somehow repeated through history. What do I mean? First, the first reason is the death of the last tenant. Maybe a widow, or maybe a widower, or maybe a few people more. Relatives and friends, relatives in particular, invade the house and take the most valuable things. My instinctive theory is that the first thing they take, one would think metal, but in the Aegean it is wood. They take the wooden parts, and there is a lot of literature there, for example, in villages inhabited by Greeks, which were forced to leave Turkey during the exchange of populations in 1923. They took the windows and the doors from the houses. So this is a repeated history. Then they take metal objects, because obviously they are very expensive, very hard to find, etc. And funnily enough, they leave all these large caseles, what is the word? Chests, thank you. Chests with clothing and maybe a few carpets or rugs for the house, etc. They leave personal things like photographs, small tableaus, things with little value. And they leave usually all the cooking utensils. So I suspect that if this instinctive viewing of the past that I have can be validated for the 18th, the 17th, the 16th, etc. centuries going back, the reason we don't find wooden and metal things may not be, wooden at least, may not be the endurance of the material, wood and cloth, but the normal way that a house gets deserted. So I would always prefer to think first of what might have happened, although I have no statistics about it, and I cannot substantiate my view in the very nice and neat way that you do with judging from fragments and from several finds anyhow. But starting from there, I would then go and use all the finds that you have described and try to mend the two stories into one. I think that your insight into the past, which is much more numerical and well-founded and comparative and not multifaceted, I mean interdisciplinary, sorry, that is the word I was looking for, is an enormous help for us who do research, either by profession or by hobby. But I would insist that one does not stop at the figures and the science only. That is my small comment. And one very small other one is that I agree that sources like literature, old recipe books, iconography, etc., are resourceful. But then you said yourself, they have several limitations. and one has to pick up some major ones in particular. For example, Christian iconography is a very conservative iconography, so one sees paintings, icons painted in the 19th century with vessels that definitely did not exist in the 19th century and so on. But I think you know that only very well, much better than I do. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for your comments. I just quickly want to say something. I think, therefore, it's a good idea of you and the French School that we organize this lecture series. I think because we can learn from each other, you know. I'm not saying that I have the final word. I have never this pretension that I have the final word. And I would love to get also in discussion with all of you in order to, you know, come to and reach to new and exchange experience, information, and also to reach new results, of course. That's the good thing, of course. Of course, I've shown you a perspective from an archaeological view. You know, I'm an archaeologist, and I only can record and document and interpret it what I see in the soil and what we, you know, find from the soil, either through horizontal or vertical stratigraphy. Of course, that is a different thing than interpretation. And this is something we can still work on. I'm not saying this is the final word on the results of the things I've been showing today. And therefore, I'm very happy to get in discussion with you. And also, of course, with your experience of, you know, as you told us now, you have been traveling a lot, and I know this, in the last 20, 30 years, or even longer. In Greece, you have been, you know, visiting many potters, many kilns, many workshops, and of course, I also would like to draw from your experience and learn from you and others in the audience. So I'm not saying this is the final word, but I think it's a good start for the lecture series in the upcoming weeks.
Since I'm an archaeologist too,
okay, great.
I have to point out that I totally agree with the method you use. The laboratory, ethnographical research, and of course the archaeological sample. I have noticed through my research to the traditional, let's say, ceramic and workshops throughout Greece, that we have a gap of knowledge for 17th, 98th, and century, and we know not so well, but well, the Byzantine ceramic workshops and all the glazed pottery. I don't know in which century exactly we don't have these luxury glazed ceramics in Greece, because in the 19th century, for sure, the workshops only make everyday ceramic. Glaze is only lead glaze, and it's very rare until the beginning of 20th century. And there is a gap of knowledge between the medieval or Byzantine times to this kind of pottery I know from my research and survey. And then after the refugees of the Asia Minor, we have a new era with, again, glazed pottery, again, new technology in pottery, etc., until the modern time of pottery in Greece, which is another chapter. So I don't know what happens there, and if you have knowledge from your research or to all this part of Greece about what happens when we lose, let's say, the Byzantine tradition, not in shape, in decoration mostly, and in the technology of glaze. And we pass to the other era, which of course has to do with the Ottoman period, of course has to do with the finance of Greece. They are poor people. They cannot, they don't have the luxury of this material, which I know that it's very important for somebody to know the technology. That's why the archaeology is very important for our knowledge, because when you know how a glazed ceramic is made in contrary to a non-glazed ceramic, then you understand why poor potters don't use glaze, not only if it's necessary. For example, in the pottery, for oil mostly.
Okay, well, to answer your question about the gap in knowledge, and you said especially for the 16th and 17th century, yeah? Okay. Now, I can only talk about the projects where I've worked myself, where I've seen materials. So I cannot talk about all the projects or areas in Greece, but I have two examples in mind. First of all, of course, I've worked in the Agora, as I've shown you, and we have pottery kilns found there in the early Ottoman period, where they were making 16th century pottery, glazed pottery. And actually, this kind of pottery made in Athens in this period of time was imitation of Italian wares. You see imitations of Italian maiolica, which was made here in Athens in the 16th and early 17th century. Now, if I go to another part of Greece where I have been looking at material from this period, for instance, on the island of Lesbos in Mytilene, I've been working with Hector Williams on the material from the excavations in the castle of Mytilene. There we found also pottery production. We have tripod stills and everything from the castle, showing again production in the 16th and 17th century. But interestingly, the pots made there are different from the production in Athens. So in Mytilene, which is much closer, of course, to the western coast of Turkey, we see more imitations of Ottoman wares. Yes, like from Miletus ware or Iznik ware and things like that. So that's very interesting. And I'm also very glad that I'm working now on the material from these two sites, Athens and Mytilene, together with the Greek PhD student, Adamantia Panayopoulou, who I already mentioned before, and she's going to do archaeometrical analysis on the fabrics, on the slips and the glazes of these products from Athens and Mytilene from Lesbos, so that we can see and get to understand much better the production processes of these pots in these periods of time. So I hope in the future I can give you more results from these analyses.
Are there other questions or remarks? Yes.
I have a question about these databases and all this information what you are collecting. In how far they are, this information or these data are accessible or interchangeable, exchangeable between laboratories, institutes, because I saw, for example, these 3D models, and I'm thinking of a lot more applications that you can do with them, apart from presentation and so on. So I simply want to know what are the plans to make this data accessible via internet.
Yeah. Well, that is a duty that we have nowadays as modern scholars, that we also have to think of data management, indeed, and how to make these data in the future accessible and approachable for future researchers. And especially in the Netherlands, in the project I was talking about, which is subsidized by the Dutch government, we have to make these data accessible in the future to all scholars. And actually, I just applied for a small funding, and I hope I will get it in a few months' time, in order to make all the data from the 4 sites accessible in the future on a Dutch website. Now, with respect to the database that we have been using and that I have been showing, and if it is incomparable with other databases, I have to tell you, I normally work in certain phases. So for the documenting of material coming from an excavation, which sometimes can include thousands and thousands of fragments. I mean, in some projects I have something like 60,000 or 80,000 of fragments. It makes no sense to record every shirt. I mean, it will take years to do this. So the first phase is that you record everything in a quick way in order to do quantification of all the material. Then later you pick the things that you think are interesting in the whole corpus, the whole repertoire, and then you go and move more into detail, into the fabrics, into the glazes, the slips, the types, the shapes, etc. And that is, of course, recorded in a different database, a database which I think for your lab would be more interesting because there we record much better, of course, also the fabric characteristics. Now, I know that every project and every lab has its own database and data management, and it's of course difficult to compare these databases in the future. Well, as you know, we already tried to do this in some workshops here in Athens, and I would love to stay in touch with everybody here in order to create a kind of universal database that could be approachable for many. I know, and to exchange information. But you can be sure that the work and the databases of the 4 sites that I've shown today will be online in the future.
Other questions or remarks about database or shapes, functions? No more questions, it seems. Mm-hmm. So, again, I thank you very much, all of us, to be here this night for this first seminar. I thank you again for a very interesting paper and conference. And I tell that the next seminar is on... yes, I have 2 weeks, the 9th November. Yes, Eurospace. Thank you for the information. So thank you again and have a good evening. Thank you.
Yeah.